There's a group of people who want to erase the monuments to the remembrance of the American past. There have been people who've wanted to remove George Washington from schools. There's even been talk, maybe somewhat casually, but still somewhat ominously, I think, about removing the Jefferson Memorial from D.C. And all of this in the name of the fact that the founders were slave owners. To complain about the founders in this way is to do so in a very ignorant way about human nature. It's easy for all of us in this generation, whether you're black or white. Racism still exists, no doubt, but it's easy for all of us in this generation to say slavery was a moral evil. But we didn't earn that. We grew up into a world where that was already true. And if we're going to be honest with ourselves, if we were similarly situated in the 18th century, a lot of people think, well, I would have thought this. I would have thought slavery was evil. I'm like, really? I don't know myself enough to be absolutely sure of that. Thomas Jefferson was born into a world where from his very cradle, his family owned slaves. And he was willed slaves by his family's will. And he got them, I think, when he was a teenager. Does that make it right? Of course it doesn't. Absolutely not. But that was the world that he, George Washington, and other founders were born into. The world we were born into was that moral victory had already been won. At this point, that moral victory had not been won. And so what do we see with these founders who are born into such a world? We see that they created a system where, first of all, not a single one of them had a single sentence to support slavery. In fact, this is something most people don't know. A lot of people trying to remove Washington from elementary schools. Washington freed his slaves at his death. Washington not only freed them, but in his will, he provided that his estate would pay for their food, for their clothing, especially for the elderly and the younger. He provided for his estate to pay for their education, to teach them useful skills so they could be useful in the world. Most people have no idea about that. In fact, and this is why it's so interesting that there's so many people these days who know almost nothing about the founders except they were slave owners. They were, but they know no context. That's why it's so fascinating to me. Frederick Douglass, an actual slave, someone who was born in irons, praises Washington. He praises the founders. There's a famous speech he did in the 1850s called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" And a lot of people, they quote very selectively to make it sound like he's making a case against the founders. Quite the opposite. In that speech, if you read the full thing, he has full praise for the founders, and Washington in particular. He used a biblical example. He said, back in Jesus' day, the Jews would say to Jesus, well, we have Abraham for our father. Why do we need you? And Jesus basically told them, you guys aren't living up to Abraham's name. Abraham had faith in God. We all know the Bible story. And Frederick Douglass made the same case. He said, this is Frederick Douglass's words, Washington, who could not die without freeing his slaves, you claim he's your father and that you build his monument with slave labor. Shame on you. He basically accused the next generation of dropping the ball that the founders had given to them. And so that's from an actual slave. And I tend to believe the actual slave over the people who are sipping on lattes at Starbucks, presuming to be the moral superiors of the founders. Booker T. Washington was another slave. Amazing man. I think his autobiography is one of the most important books ever written, Up From Slavery. But you'll notice what his last name is, Washington. That's not a coincidence. He also loved Washington. When you look at old pictures from the Tuskegee Institute, where he didn't found it, but he made it what it was. There's a picture of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln in every classroom. Is that a coincidence that another former slave who is familiar with history and studied the Constitution, Frederick Douglass called the Constitution a great liberty document. The very first day that the Constitution allowed for the banning of the slave trade, January 1st, 1808, Congress had already passed the law, Jefferson signed it, and it went into effect on January 1st, 1808. That's how quickly it was going. Now, there's a lot of history that's more complicated, but as far as the founders, you'll find Adams didn't own a slave, Hamilton didn't own a slave, John Jay was against slavery, Benjamin Rush was against slavery, George Washington was against slavery, James Madison was against slavery. Was there a certain level of hypocrisy with some of these men? There's no doubt. The point is, they set up a world where the fact that they grew up into a world where slavery was entirely acceptable and they themselves did not accept it, at least intellectually, many of them, is a big thing. It'd be like growing up in a world, the next generation will probably grow up in a world where gay marriage is entirely acceptable. And it'd be like them growing up in a normal house where maybe it's neither really bad or really good, and coming to the conclusion, this is really not good. We need to have marriage between a man and a woman. That was kind of what the founders were. They grew up in a world where this thing was entirely acceptable. They concluded otherwise. They set up a system which would eliminate it eventually, would even go to war to eliminate it. And is it morally ambiguous? Yes, there are ambiguities in it, there's no doubt. But for these people to presume that the founders of the United States should be erased from our collective memory is abhorrent. Their sins are being used as an issue to erase everything that they said, which is incredibly dangerous. It's not just dangerous, it's ignorant. It's absolutely ignorant. Should we erase Plato from history? Should we erase Aristotle? Both these men supported slavery. Should we erase Confucius? Certainly by modern standards, Confucius was a raging misogynistic woman hater by today's standards. Should we not read Confucius anymore? What about Sun Tzu? What about some of the Jewish sages? What about some of the Renaissance thinkers? I mean, you go down the line and there are plenty of people in history whose views did not and whose actions did not match up with modern sensibilities. There's plenty of people today who act in these ways. You know, to act as if we're somehow morally superior to all these people is nonsense, in my opinion.